Welcome to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. Hope you're having a great day as we continue to celebrate so much about Mississippi and the people who are working so hard to make this such a great place to live, work, and play. We're in hurricane season now, and I was just chatting with my wife Ann this morning as there's been this kind of lull. You know, we have Beryl that came through. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. And then we have a lull, and she's saying, you know, wonder what's up. I said, this is normal. This is normal for this time of year. But enjoy it while you got it, because it's going to be a really, really busy season. And I was looking at some of the percentages for coastal Mississippi, and they are high in terms of the possibilities for us to get at least a direct hit, in some cases maybe skirting by us, but some impact from a named storm or a hurricane or even a major. The percentages don't look so hot, so it's going to be a busy year. Listen, I usually center my conversations around Josh Morgerman, the top hurricane chaser in the world, around a chase that he's been involved in. We've had him recently because he built a house in Bay St. Louis. He has a place in L.A. as well. And he's got a base of operation from the Hurricane House here in Bay St. Louis. But he chased Beryl, and we're going to talk about that here in just a minute. We're just going to get caught up because it's been a few weeks since we've had the opportunity to chat with my friend, the top hurricane chaser in the world, Cyclone, Weather Nation, you name it. This guy's involved in it, and he's also a friend. Josh, how you doing, my friend?
Good, Ricky. Always good to be back on air with you. It's my comfort zone.
Hey, listen, I tell you, man, Beryl, really interesting storm. We're going to come back to Beryl in just a second, but the most severe hurricane ever recorded in the Caribbean got to Category 5 status really rapidly, made a bunch of records, and then you chased it on the Yucatan Peninsula and in Texas, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. As I was mentioning before before we started the show, I actually went to Panama City this week. A friend of mine's mother died and went over for the funeral, and I passed back through the visit with my friend George Corchus at his 30A restaurants. It was terrific, always great to go and spend some time with George and his family and have a wonderful meal there and back in the day. But while I was in Panama City, I'm reminded of one of the reasons I don't like tropical systems, and that is the damage it does to trees. A lot of pine trees in that area of the country. So the ones that survived, some are standing straight, obviously, but some are still leaning, and they'll be leaning, I guess, for the rest of their lives. And pine trees, if you knock the crown out of them, we learned this well on our own experiences, the tree dies. But pretty noticeable damage still from Hurricane Michael. You chase that storm. That's a storm we don't want to see in coastal Mississippi, where it just goes from nothing to something dramatic in just a short period of time. That was a scary storm, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. I think Hurricane Michael was one of the best illustrations of how hurricane forecasting, when it comes to track, when it comes to forecasting where it's going to go, it's getting better and better. The computer models are getting more and more accurate. They're getting really good. You look at hurricanes like Laura in Mississippi, and they got the track right days in advance. They pretty much knew exactly where it was going to come in. But forecasting hurricane intensity remains a very mysterious art. And Michael was an example of that. I remember when it first formed, the first forecast from the Hurricane Center had it coming in as barely a hurricane. They had it hitting the Florida Panhandle as a minimal 75-mile-an-hour wind hurricane. And then look what happened. It came in as the fourth strongest in U.S. history, Category 5. And that just goes to show you how it's just so hard to anticipate these things, because the mechanisms that go into intensity are they're just so delicate, and they're not completely understood. So I think that was one of the interesting things about it. And also another thing that Michael did, which it seems a lot of hurricanes hitting the U.S. in the last decade have done, is they kind of explode right offshore. Like, they don't look that bad, and then as they get near the coast, kaboom, they just suddenly rapidly intensify. That's what Michael did. That's what Laura did. And to some degree, on a smaller scale, that's actually kind of what Beryl did just off the Texas coast last week.
Yeah, Beryl, obviously most of the experts worried that it was going to have this window of opportunity because obviously the seed was there for something tremendous to happen. We already knew in its history that it had been a record breaker already. But as it neared the shore of Texas, it was really kind of a ragged storm, and then it found that window of opportunity, and it started ramping up. And of course, the experts believed strongly that had it had more time over water, Texas would have been looking at a very severe situation. So you just never know, do you? Some are breaking up as it's making its way inland. Michael was super scary because people went to bed at night the night before thinking, I've prepared for Category 1. We've dodged a bullet this time, and wake up the next morning, it's Category 5. And it caught so many people off guard. And it was like this huge tornado, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Another interesting thing about Michael was how, and you see this a lot with intense, rapidly intensifying hurricanes, as they're on the upswing, as they're rapidly intensifying, they're actually quite small. The energy is very compact. It's very tightly wound around the center. And you notice that with Michael, as it came in, as it hit Florida, it was actually not a large hurricane. And the core of damaging winds was actually quite small. And I think one of the most dramatic illustrations of that, after the hurricane, I wrote it out in a town called Callaway, just east of Panama City. We went through the eye. We got the kind of western edge of the eye. We were in the comma. But that left eye wall, that really intense part of the storm, passed right over Panama City and absolutely devastated the place. And it was very different than Hurricane Katrina in Mississippi. Katrina in Mississippi, we talk about it more as a water event. That there were certainly destructive winds, but what made Katrina so distinctive and such a milestone storm, such an historic storm, was that record-breaking storm surge, that just unbelievable wall of water. With Michael, it was actually not that as much. There were some storm surge down in Mexico Beach, but in Panama City, which took a direct hit and which was devastated, this was a wind event. All of that devastation was wind. The city actually, because it was on the left side, had very little, there wasn't really a lot of storm surge damage. This was just wind flattening buildings. But back to my point about the compact wind field, Panama City is right next to a separate city called Panama City Beach. They're actually separate cities. Panama City Beach escaped almost untouched. They had maybe Category 1 winds, maybe something like that, but there was almost no wind damage, whereas Panama City was devastated. And the distance going from complete destruction to almost no destruction was maybe at 1 or 2 city blocks. You'd go from collapsed buildings to flimsy restaurant canopies hardly touched by the wind. That was how tightly wound this thing. So it almost was like a big tornado where you had that sharp cutoff with the damage. It was fascinating.
I don't want any of them at the end of the day. But coming back to Beryl, here's a storm, a seed from the Atlantic in the main development region. As it approached the island chain there, it really ramped up rapidly. And those small islands, man, it just decimated the islands that it passed over. You thought about going, but you've had a history of saying, and this is very true, it's hard to island hop. When you're on the mainland U.S., you can, or even Mexico, wherever, Philippines, you can move around. Now, some places you can move around better than other places, obviously. But when you're on one island and it hits another island, it's not like you can get in a plane and fly to. So it's hard to chase when there's islands involved, isn't there? Isn't it?
Yeah. I call it island roulette, and it's my least favorite kind of chasing because to me it feels very passive. You have to, 24, 36 hours in advance, you got to pick an island, and then you have to stay there. You actually can't chase anymore. You're actually just stuck on that island, just kind of waiting. And there's something very passive about that experience that I don't like. That said, some of my, the top chases of my career have been island chases. The number one would be Hurricane Dorian on Great Abaco Island in the Bahamas, which was not just a Category 5, but a high-end Category 5. And that one, I hit the bullseye, went right through that eye. Was trapped there for days afterward. That was probably, I'd call that the holy grail of my sort of career. That was an island chase. So I don't I don't avoid it outright, but it's not my favorite kind of chasing. And that time around, I didn't do it. There's also the climatology. What Beryl did was very unusual. Usually storms, Beryl's whole track and intensity pattern was more typical of something you'd see in late August, not late June. For it to form so far out, basically come off the African coast, ramp up like it did, and become a full-fledged hurricane before even entering the Caribbean, that's a late summer thing. That's not a June thing. So climatologically, it was pretty abnormal. And I think that my decisions as a chaser are often informed by climatology, and I think I was just thinking, yeah, I don't think this thing is gonna ramp up that much before the islands, and it did.
Unbelievable. I mean, record breaker. I mean, all the experts were just, dumbfounded by what occurred and worried this is a harbinger of what we will see in August and September. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Josh Morgerman and talk specifically about going to the Yucatan to chase Beryl. We'll see you after this. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. We're visiting with my friend, the top hurricane chaser in the world, Josh Morgerman. And if you go to any of the tropical blogs or anybody who is involved in the tropics, they know Josh. They follow Josh. They constantly are posting about Josh or reposting something that Josh posted. He is well known. He's a big time celebrity, especially in the tropical community. So, Josh, we're talking about Beryl. What was interesting. Gosh, man. I mean, we got lucky with Beryl because we had this little high that was protecting us. But that high is not normally there. We just got lucky, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. I mean, it's always a matter of, the positions of the highs. That's what decides whether you get nailed or you get off lucky. One thing that was interesting about Beryl was it took what I call a Caribbean cruiser track where it stayed at a really low latitude for a lot of its life cycle, basically went not straight west, but kind of west-northwest through the Caribbean into the Yucatan, into Texas. What you find if you look at the tracks for any one hurricane season, you'll see sort of like a trend, like a lot of them kind of seem to follow like the same general pattern. So there are years where everything kind of forms out the Atlantic and then it quickly curves out to sea. So, toward Bermuda or the Azores. Those are years when the ridging out in the Atlantic is not as strong. So the hurricanes find that opening to just kind of pass into the open Atlantic. And then you have years where the ridging over the Atlantic is really, really strong, and the storms basically, they just keep west until they hit North America. And if Beryl is a harbinger of things to come, which some folks are saying it is, this looks like the kind of year where we've got that strong ridging where stuff is going to make it across the Caribbean and into Mexico or into the Gulf of Mexico, which of course then in Mississippi, we got to really, once something gets into the Gulf, we got to watch it really closely. Now, in this instance, the ridging was strong enough that it kept the hurricane well south and pushed it into Texas. But imagine if that ridging was just a little less strong and it had a little more of an opening, it could have curved a little more north. And instead of hitting Matagorda, Texas, it could have been, Biloxi, Mississippi.
It was interesting watching model performance because some models foreshadowed this turn to the northwest and to the north, and the consensus was still into upper Mexico coast, and then it actually started to they all started to kind of converge more around more of a Texas hit than a Mexico hit. But, some models are performing really well. I mean, I know you study this a lot, but the National Hurricane Center in general has gotten really good at determining track. And you got some new AI models that are coming out. I mean, it's we don't have a shortage of models to pay attention to, do we?
No, and it almost becomes overwhelming because there's so many. When I sit down to kind of, when I'm on a chase, I'm assessing the models very closely, at least 4 times a day, sometimes even more often. But being able to weigh the different models and say, okay, these are valid, these ones are biased, that becomes sort of the art. Folks talk about the spaghetti models and they've got all those colored lines and they're all showing different things. one of the dangers there is that not all models are created equal. Not all of those colored lines have the same validity. And so in the hands of folks who don't know what they're doing, they don't know how to weigh the different models, and they can see things happening that aren't really happening. So that's why you need the experts to kind of, interpret them, and that's what it's one of the sort of dangers of all this information being available now, is that everyone's sort of become an armchair expert. I have folks on Twitter all the time asking me, hey, which models should I follow? Do you believe in the spaghetti models? And what I always tell them is just follow the National Hurricane Center. If you're not a chaser, if you're not like a pro chaser who's going out to hunt down the eye to collect data, you don't need to follow all that stuff. That's what the Hurricane Center does. The Hurricane Center has the top experts in the world whose job it is to look at all that tangle of tracks and then figure out, okay, which ones are really having a handle on the storm, which ones aren't, and then from all that, distilling a most likely forecast track. So I always tell folks, don't make it more complicated than it is. We have a whole government agency, which is, by the way, the best in the world, focused on telling you exactly where it's going and whether you need to be ready or not. You don't need to do your own research about this.
Hey, the way I tell people to think about it, and you're so right about that, is to think of the National Hurricane Center as a model. Think of them as a consensus model. They're, as you pointed out, they're best in the world. They're looking at all these different outcomes. And if you look at the National Hurricane Center compared to all in history, especially the more recent history, if you just go back 5 years, National Hurricane Centers outperformed the models. It's because they're just good at it. They've just gotten good at it.
Exactly. And I like the way you put that about how the Hurricane Center is almost like a consensus model, and one with the human input that's able to kind of weigh for biases and things. I'm a strong believer that at the end of the day, nothing replaces sort of that human expertise, or at least that human expertise and subjective judgment should be part of the mix. I don't think we can give it all over to computers yet, but yeah, 100%. I think the Hurricane Center is doing all the hard work for you. Don't make it complicated. You don't need to do your own research. Doesn't mean don't take an interest in it and learn about the models. But at the end of the day, the top experts who have a lot more knowledge than you have, they're going to tell you where they think it's going and how strong it's going to be. Now, does that mean that the Hurricane Center is right all the time? No, they're not. No one can ever be right all the time. Forecasting tropical cyclones there's like an era. There's an element of mystery in it. We don't totally understand it all. But this is the best anywhere in the world. We're very lucky to have such a good agency forecasting our hurricanes.
Hey, listen, coming back to Beryl now. So if I have your chase history well pegged, this is the third double landfall chase that you've done involving the Yucatan Peninsula. Is that right?
Fourth actually, because there have been 4 hurricanes that I chased on the Yucatan and then chased somewhere else. Now, 3 of those I ended up back in the U.S. One was Delta, which was in Louisiana. The next one was Zeta, which the second impact I rode out on my porch in Bay St. Louis as the whole Mississippi coast got raked by that storm. And then the other one was Grace, which was one that it stayed in Mexico. So it did what Beryl was supposed to do, where it hit the Yucatan and then it stayed south and then hit the east coast of Mexico. So Beryl was actually my 4th.
Ah, interesting. Okay, so look, let's tell people how you're watching the situation. You decide not to go down to the Caribbean, and you're watching now the track. You see that it's probably going to be Yucatan, and you chase. That's what you do. So you make a decision. I'm going. Do you try flying to Gulfport Airport, or you go to New Orleans, or how do Yucatan's your second home now?
Yeah. I love Gulfport Biloxi is my favorite airport because man, talk about a easy, hassle-free airport. I mean, you get from your car on, to the gate in 1 minute, 38 seconds. I mean, I love that airport. It's so it takes the drudgery of air travel away. But the problem with that airport is you got to connect almost no matter where you're going. It's a connecting flight. So I generally, for international chases, I fly out of New Orleans because then I can get some, good nonstops.
Yeah. So you make a decision. I'm going to Yucatan. So from the time you make the decision to the time you're on the plane, how much time has passed? Is it like you just leave now? You just go? Or what do you do?
It could be anywhere. I can make that decision 24 hours in advance. Sometimes I've made that decision literally like 3 hours in advance or 2 hours, where I'm literally like, I'm on the computer making the reservation and I'm throwing stuff in a bag, and then just kind of racing to the airport. I mean, a lot of times it's hard to decide whether to kind of pull the trigger and go those can be real kind of, I've had situations where I've almost missed my flight to a chase because I just was so racked with indecision. I couldn't decide until the very last second. I've tried to get better about that. Now with Beryl, it was an easier decision. I think I decided fairly early on, okay, there's going to be a hurricane impact there. The Yucatan is a nice big piece of land, so there's a lot of room to maneuver. It's not island roulette. You have a lot of room to kind of refine your position. So that makes it, for me, an inviting chase turf, I would call it.
Yeah, and the highway system, I've been there a few times. The highway system there, for the most part, you can go north and south pretty easily. Yeah. So, and that I'm sure that factors into making it a little bit better. Hey, so when you're traveling, though, you're traveling with weather devices, measuring devices, and do you check that, or do you? We're getting to the end of the segment. We'll pick up the answer on the other side, or do you carry it on? And do people wonder what are these things, and are they bombs? And I'm just curious about all that. When we get back on the other side, we'll get the answer to the question of what does he travel with when he heads to a place like, especially internationally, does it pique the interest from a security point of view even more? I don't know. We'll see more about that when we get on the other side with Josh Morgerman. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank studio. We have my friend Josh Morgerman, Cyclone, the top hurricane chaser in the world, and we're just chatting about when he makes a decision, as he did with Beryl, to go to the Yucatan, knowing that he's probably going to go from there to another Mexican city or maybe to a Texas city, which ultimately he ended up doing. When he makes a decision to go to the Yucatan, he travels with a bunch of devices that he deploys and gathers a lot of important data while he's doing what he's doing. Anyway, do you ever get security wondering what are these devices?
Oh yeah, all the time. They're kind of weird looking. They're these devices are called. I have two kinds of devices. One is called a kestrel meter, which looks kind of like it looks sort of like a mobile phone, but it's a very bright color. It's yellow. But then there are these other devices called kestrel drops, which are these. I wish I had them in my hand. I would have done show and tell, but they're these little. Basically, they look like almost like the size and shape of an egg, and they're bright colors like red and blue. So what I like to do is when a hurricane's coming ashore, I plant these devices along the coast. I space them 5 or 10 miles apart to get sort of like a high resolution pressure profile of the hurricane as it comes in. Sorry to nerd out on half your listeners are probably like falling asleep from this, but spreading those out along the coast, means I have to bring a bunch of them. So I've got this bag full of these things. And yeah, occasionally the folks at customs are just like, they're looking and they're like, okay, they don't recognize them. They're like, what is this stuff? And I have to explain it. And, my Spanish isn't amazing. And that's always like my favorite task on a chase is trying to explain in Spanish, that I'm doing meteorological research. And somehow I always get through, they somehow, I've not had them taken away from me yet.
So, okay, so I'm assuming you're flying into Cancun, right?
Usually, although there's actually been an exciting change, which is the Yucatan Peninsula has a new airport, a new international airport down in Tulum, which I was going to fly into this time, but I didn't because the Tulum airport was actually going to be closer to where the hurricane was coming in. And, rule number one is don't fly to an airport that's going to get damaged. Fly into one nearby. So Cancun was a little north of the impact zone, so I flew into Cancun. Interesting.
And you rent a car.
Yes.
So you rent a car. And does the car rental company know that you're a hurricane chaser?
And one of the most important things I always say when you're chasing, a hurricane is treat the car like it's your own. treat it like absolutely be a grown up about it and literally shield it just like you would shield your own car. And that's one of the most important things. Now, what's interesting is on some chases, my renting the car actually saved the car. Like, for example, in Dorian in the Bahamas, the storm surge wiped out, I think, a lot of the rental companies' fleet of cars. The one that they rented to me was saved because I was on a hill. And it was not hit by any flying debris or anything. So it was an example of how actually, I actually brought their car to a safer place than it would have been otherwise.
There's so much nuance to what you do, and you've been committed to this since a young man. And it's, we've talked about this before. You're taking risks. It's measured risk. Based on experience and wisdom. You've been in tough situations. We've talked about those before. From High-End to Dorian to Patricia, you've seen some of the most incredible storms in history, actually, from the inside, from the eye. So you bring with you tremendous experience. There's a noted and alarming trend that I see in some of the tropical blogs where young guys and others are deciding to call themselves chasers now, and they're out running around and reporting about it in social media, and X give them the ability to be reporters and whatever. And they might find it. I think, what I think we're headed toward, Josh? I think we're headed toward, during Hurricane Katrina, homeless community kind of found each other and went to places on the beach and were killed together, because they didn't make good decisions as it related to that. We're actually headed toward some kind of disaster like that with some of these storm chasers. I hate to say it, but I think it's true that they're putting themselves in really compromising situations, and they don't have the experience to be able to do and make good decisions like you. Like, you thinking a lot about surge and where it's going to be, and the wind and what about buildings that can withstand. And that's why you don't like a lot of people running with you. You're mostly a lone chaser. Internationally, you may end up with someone, but that's because you trust them. Do you see this trend? Do you see more people out running around when you're doing chases today than you used to see?
100%. Chasing has it's become trendy. When I was first chasing hurricanes, back when I was young, back when I was in my 20s, it was not a popular sport. Not a lot of people did it. And this was also before social media. So the incentive structure was totally different. Back then, this was before I had an audience, before I'd ever been on TV, before there was such a thing as social media. My early chases, this is going to be shocking to some people. I didn't even bring a camera. It wasn't even important to me to shoot footage. It was all about just being in the moment and connecting with the hurricane in the moment. It did not even matter to me. I didn't travel with devices for collecting data, nothing. It was just about being in the moment and connecting with it. And, even for me.
Okay, hey, just real quick, just connecting with a hurricane, this death wish weirdness about you. What a strange thing to want to do.
I think a lot of people understand, though. When I meet Mississippians, one of the things I like about living here is that everyone's sort of, at least coastal Mississippi, I should say, coastal Mississippi. Everyone's kind of a closet hurricane nerd. Everyone here has an interest in the subject matter. Everyone has a story to share. Everyone has some, varying levels of expertise, but people here are they're interested and they can talk about it. From LA, and in LA, it's like that with earthquakes. So you could have really interesting discussions about earthquakes with random people in LA who know about S waves and P waves and why their house was damaged or why it wasn't damaged. So here you have this society of hurricane nerds, and you'd be surprised how many Mississippians I meet. I could tell they've got that glimmer in their eye when they talk about it, that they find it interesting and they know what I'm talking about when I talk about connecting.
But I see what you do. I mean, so that's today. I'm today. you're reporting for Weather Nation. For today, you're gathering important scientific data. Today, you're using all of this experience to tell an incredibly important story. And in spite of all these other hurricane chasers, people still lean on you. They know that you're the guy that if there were a world record for being inside a storm, you would get it. People know that. But I'm saying back when you were young, you didn't even have you said you didn't even bring a camera. That, even then, I mean, this Long Island kid that just decided that he's going to have this infatuation for storms, that's really what I'm talking about. I mean, this early thing,
Oh yeah. And I've often said this, that the pro storm chasers, the ones like the top dogs who are really doing this professionally, doing it around the world, going into really dangerous situations. I don't mean casual chasers who just chase in their backyard, but ones who are really doing this. I think that it's something that you're born with. I think that there's something about your brain that draws you to this. It's almost like a kind of addiction. I mean, just to be perfectly honest, there's something a little imbalanced about it. I've often joked, but there's a level of seriousness in it when I say that it's a toxic lifestyle. And it is, you know what I mean? And I think that's why I'm such a fitness nut, because I'm almost trying to kind of counterbalance the toxicity of just the chaser lifestyle, which is horrible. Just even after Beryl, I'm driving home from Texas and, I'm like, and I'm just, it's a long drive and I'm tired, and every few hours I got to pull over and sleep in the car for a couple of hours because I was just like sort of zonked. Yeah, that's an unhealthy lifestyle, eating at gas stations, all this stuff. There's a really horrible underbelly to this lifestyle, which is not what I aspire to, but it is what it is. To hunt down the storm and have that experience, you got to put.
But you're gathering such important information. Again, all of these and the videos, people can go to iCyclone at YouTube and see for yourself. And he's gathering. Just not just scientific data, but there's video evidence of what these various categories of storms are, and what you're doing to educate people who may now live on the coast who not experienced anything like this before. When someone says, no, you definitely don't want. If the authorities say get out, you need to get out. Well, no, I think I can. No, you don't understand. You go to this video, iCyclone YouTube site, and look up this particular storm. That's what you're saying yes to. That kind of stuff is important to people. So. Okay, so you fly into Cancun, could have gone into Tulum. It's cool that they have an international airport now.
Yeah.
Come in, you rent a car. And it's just kind of textbook chase after that point, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's just sort of trying to refine your position, in relation to where the core of the hurricane comes in. And by core, I mean that if you look at a hurricane on radar, the intense part of it, the eye wall, is actually a little ring. It's a little circle and near the center of the storm, and that's the part that you're hunting. And in the middle of that, of course, is the calm eye. Now, one of the challenges of chasing on the Yucatan is that the radar, sometimes it's working, sometimes it isn't. So that's a challenge, because you really want radar. We're so spoiled in the U.S. We have an amazing radar system. Most locations on the coast, including, like, for example, Mississippi, we're covered under multiple radar sites. So if the one near New Orleans goes out, then like we have the Mobile one.
We'll pick it up from right there and hear the rest of the Beryl story as he wrote it out in Yucatan and then Texas. We'll see after this with John. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. Well, look, it's a lull in the action in the hurricane season right now, but you look at all the atmospheric conditions, you look at ocean heat content, you look at shear forecast, you look at positions of the high in the Atlantic, and even today, if you look at some of the satellite views, you see a lot of Saharan dust. But you see south of the Saharan dust, you see some waves, and they're at a very low. Their profile is low, and it just comes back to your point that more than likely we're going to be seeing some Caribbean cruisers coming in, getting into the Gulf of Mexico, sort of like Beryl. Hey, let's get through Beryl real quick, because I want to circle back on the young chasers, because I don't know that we completely finished that conversation. You write it out. on the Yucatan, and then you make a decision to go to Texas. We didn't know what kind of storm we were dealing with, but as you pointed out a few minutes ago, it started to wind up pretty good as it started to make landfall. We have family in Texas, and people in Texas, there's still people in Texas, in Houston today, that still don't have power, which is amazing to me. The widespread power outages were very, very significant. I don't think they staged properly for the storm. They didn't realize they were going to get this kind of impact. And once again, every storm has its own personality, right, buddy?
100%.
So go ahead.
And I think one of the things, Beryl illustrates a lot of important points. One is that a Category 1 hurricane is a hurricane. Take it seriously. Never say, oh, it's only a Category 1. Beryl is a Category 1, and look at how many millions of lives this thing disrupted. So that's number one. Two, hurricanes that are intensifying as they come in off the Gulf, I mean, they're on a strengthening trend. They tend to keep their destructive intensity a little further inland, and we saw that with Beryl, that it was well inland over Texas and still producing destructive winds. But the third thing, and I think the most important, is that it's not just the hurricane strength, it's how it aims, okay? And if you look at Beryl's track, it took the perfect track to really smash Metro Houston. It came in a little west of Houston, and what that meant is as it came in and as it was still a hurricane, what we call the right front quad, which is the sort of the right front side of the eye wall, that part, that's strong, which is usually the strongest part of the hurricane, that part passed right over Metro Houston, over the most densely populated part of Texas. And that's why this was so destructive. So people are like shocked by the impact, and they're like, oh, it must have been a Category 2. It must have been stronger. No, it was actually just a Category 1 hurricane, but it aimed just right to really, really kind of smack Houston upside its head.
Hey, so you look at the wobbles as it approached. It also had a bit of a northwest turn to it as well. See, factoring the wobble with the turn, that had to have made getting in the right spot because you were in the eye wall. Was that a challenge for you?
Yeah, there's always that as a hurricane comes in, you're watching it on radar, and there is usually some wobbling. I like to get right in the eye, and that requires usually some last minute maneuvering, which was the case here. First I was going to be in Port Lavaca, then it was Palacios, Texas, then it was like I kept going further east, then I was all the way to Sargent, then there was that little bit of a northwest wobble that you talked about, so I had to go double back west, and Matagorda was my final choice. And one of the things about this part of Texas, it's not like coastal Mississippi. Think about it. In coastal Mississippi, we have Highway 90, and then we also have the 10. So you have two nice east-west roads where you could get exactly where you want to be on the coast. Okay, in Texas, that part of Texas, that part is not that way. You have to, you want to go from Sargent to Matagorda. You don't drive along the coast. You have to go inland and go around and come back out. So that made it really challenging. Those final minutes of the chase were a lot of driving to get there into the right position in time.
More like your Mexico chase last year where the highway system is so complicated. Hey, let's get back to this troubling trend of young chasers. Hopefully that's just a fad.
It's a good question. Definitely storm chasing's gotten a little more, it's gotten more trendy. And I think that with the release of the movie Twisters, in the next couple of weeks, I think that's going to add to it. Films, movies have a way of doing that. They spark trends. Of course, that's tornado chasing, but hurricane chasing is related. I'm very conflicted about this topic. I was a young newbie chaser, not that long ago, and I remember some of the veterans like sort of not taking my work seriously or thinking I was dumb or thinking I was doing stupid things. I remember when I went down to the Yucatan Peninsula in 2007 to chase Category 5 Dean by myself. I remember getting a lot of abuse from seniors being like, oh God, he's just stupid. He doesn't know what he's getting into. So I never want to discourage young people. I want them to follow their passions. On the other hand, I don't want to encourage it because God forbid, what if I do encourage someone to follow this dream and they end up dying in the storm or something else? So it's really It's not like other sports where, it's like if it's tennis, you can encourage young tennis players to really follow their dream. This is one where I'm constantly conflicted about it because at the end of the day, this is really dangerous work.
I think that's really great advice. People should hear that. And as we'll have Josh back pretty regularly during the hurricane season, but just remember that this law is an opportunity to prepare because we're looking at a very, very busy season. And there's not an expert who doesn't say that's going to be the case. And it's probably going to be a Gulf of Mexico season, as Josh pointed out. Josh, it's been a pleasure, my friend.
Great to be back, Ricky. Thanks.
You bet. You bet. Hey, listen, have a great day, and we will see you tomorrow.